The 2023 NBA draft featured just one college basketball player selected in the top 5. Is this a one-year aberration, or is it a sign of things to come? Let's discuss.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, happy Friday. Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Andy Patton. Again, happy Friday. We are all over yesterday's NBA draft results. On today's episode, we're going to discuss the breakdown of conferences for the selected players, what it means for those conferences, what it means for college basketball as a whole, as we saw a lot of international and G League players selected in this draft cycle. We're also going to discuss the future for college centers. Man, they did not get well represented in this NBA draft. What does that mean going forward? And we're also going to talk about some draft superlatives to close out the show. But I want to lead off talking about the top of the NBA draft because, unsurprisingly, we only saw one college player selected in the top 5. And I say unsurprisingly, there were some rumors at 5 or even 4. Cam Whitmore was in that conversation. We'll talk more about him later in the show. Jarace Walker was in the conversation as a top 5 pick. But ultimately, what happened in the draft? Victor Wembanyama went number 1 to the San Antonio Spurs, the least surprising first pick in the NBA draft in a very, very long time. Brandon Miller went number 2 to the Charlotte Hornets. Weren't kind of sure whether that was going to be Scoot Henderson from the G League Ignite or whether Brandon Miller was going to sneak into that number 2 spot. He did. The Blazers took Henderson at 3rd. No surprise there. And then 4 and 5, the Houston Rockets, Detroit Pistons. That's where we weren't sure. I know our friend Leaf Tulane, who's on the podcast for Thursday's episode, is a regular contributor here. He mentioned that 4 is kind of when the draft starts. Of when we're finally going to see what changes may or may not happen, how the board might shift in that regard. And what we saw was the 2 twins from the Overtime Elite G League program, the Ausar and Amen Thompson. They went 4 and 5. Amen went 4th to Houston. Ausar went 5th to Detroit. And so we ended up with the top 5 that only featured one college basketball player. And I kind of teased it at the beginning there of how concerning is this? Does this mean much? And ultimately, I think it's probably a one-year aberration. But having said that, I think that the G League and the Overtime Elite should be thrilled with the results. They should be happy to see some of their high-end talent getting respected the way that they were. How it translates in the NBA is obviously the big question. If the Thompson twins, we were pretty confident in Wemby, barring some kind of injury, he's going to be great. Pretty confident in Scoot as well. To be honest, he looks like a young Derrick Rose. He really does look like he's that caliber of player. If the Thompson twins reach their potential, which right now is kind of curbed by whether they can shoot at the next level. They didn't really look like great shooters at the G League level, but they looked excellent athletically and in pretty much every other way, facilitation, all of that stuff. If those 2 guys really excel, I do wonder what that will do long term. Is it going to kill college basketball? No. People have been talking about college basketball dying for this reason or that reason for literally since college basketball existed. And I don't think that a few players doing well at the top of this draft is going to have a huge negative impact. But like I said, I'd be pretty darn happy if I was Sharif Abdul-Rahim, the president of the G League, if I was somebody who was significantly involved financially in Overtime Elite. Like, I would be happy with these results. And I think you see college basketball and as a whole is kind of moving away from as many one and done players and moving towards more established guys, 2, 3, 4, 5-year guys at a time. And that didn't really bear out in the NBA draft process. And again, a lot of one and done freshmen being at the top of the NBA draft is not new. It is not unusual. It is not even that surprising. But this year it was pretty dramatic. Again, one college player taken in the top 5. The first non-freshman college player to get selected was Jordan Hawkins out of UConn, who went at 14 and of course was a sophomore. Before that, all 8, Hawkins was the 9th college player selected. The 8 college players selected before him were all one and done freshmen. Of course, Miller at 2. Then you had Anthony Black, Jarace Walker, Taylor Hendricks, Cason Wallace, Jet Howard, which was a bit of a surprise pick. We'll talk more about that later. Derek Lively and Grady Dick. All of those players went before a single college player who had more than 1 year of experience. So for teams who are or for fans, teams, whomever who's kind of thinking, let's build more in the portal, like whatever, that's a great avenue to success. But if your goal is to put players in the NBA, which isn't any head coach's number one goal, let's put it that way. It shouldn't be, at least, but it is the clearest avenue towards NBA success. Go play 1 year in college and move on to the next level. And this is a tremendous group of one and done freshmen. I have, looking at this list right now, those 8 players, I have a lot of confidence that the majority of them will carve out very nice, lengthy NBA careers and won't look like busts at their draft spot. Anthony Black's a player I have a lot of confidence in, although him getting picked at 6th puts a little bit more pressure on him to perform. But for the most part, the rest of this group, again, Jet Howard was a bit of a reach pick, I thought, for Orlando. They're the ones who also took Anthony Black, so we'll see how they kind of mix and match everything there. I think a trade might be coming potentially with Jalen Suggs or Cole Anthony. But I think for the most part, this is a group of really talented freshmen and a group that doesn't really surprise me at the top. But it is interesting to see what it means for college basketball as a whole, and especially as we look at a conference breakdown. Because one of the conversations that I really enjoyed having this year and that I'm curious to track going forward is if more players will take what I'm going to call the Brandon Podziemski route. Of course, Podziemski started his career at Illinois, played very little as a freshman, transferred to Santa Clara, immediately excelled as a on-ball scorer, as a rebounder, in every facet of basketball, a great shooter, all that stuff. Ends up getting drafted by the Golden State Warriors. Get to go play with Steph Curry now and have that kind of experience in his first NBA season. I think we're going to see more of these stories. But having said that, this draft from a college side was dominated by the big boys. The SEC had 10 players selected. The Big Ten had 8 players selected. The ACC and the Big East each had 5 players selected. The Big 12 and the Pac-12 had 4 players selected. The top 6 conferences in terms of players selected were the Power 6. As much as we bash on the Pac-12 on the show, as much as we talk up some of those mid-major conferences, from a putting players in the NBA perspective, the top 6 conferences took care of business. Now, this isn't the perfect measurement for success, obviously. Just don't tell Michigan fans that. They had 2 players taken in the top 15, which is an incredible accomplishment. They didn't make the NCAA tournament, so it doesn't necessarily lead to automatic success. But it is interesting to see that generally this flows the way that you would expect it to. In fact, even after you get through the Power 6 conferences, the next 2 are the WCC and the AAC, 2 of the best non-Power 5 conferences. By pretty much every measurement. They each had 3. The A10, the MAC, the SoCon, and the Missouri Valley each had 1. And then there was 12 non-college players selected as well. And even if you break it down by rounds, the SEC had 6 in the first round. Big 10 had 5 in the first round. AAC and the Big East had 3. ACC, Big 12, and the WCC each had 2. And then the Missouri Valley and the Pac-12 had 1. Yes, that's right. The WCC had more players selected in the first round of this NBA draft in the Pac-12. Pac-12 just had Jaquez at 18. WCC had Podziemski at 19 and Julian Strawther at 29 to Denver. And then the second round, the SEC also was the winner here with 4. ACC, Big 10, and Pac-12 each had 3. Big 12 and Big East each had 2. A10, MAC, SoCon, and WCC all had 1. So yeah, I think for me, I'm very curious if we'll continue to see more Brandon Podziemski's stories. Santa Clara, as a program, has proven they can develop first-round talent. Jalen Williams last year was one of the best rookies in the entire NBA. Brandon Podziemski gets taken by the Golden State Warriors here in the first round. But there are going to be other programs like this that develop, that show up, that start being able to pull some of these talented but not playing players from Big Ten programs, from Power 5 programs, and inserting them into their starting lineup and getting them to that level. Herb Sendek is a fantastic coach at Santa Clara. That's part of the reason that this success has happened, and I think it's notable that it's happened at the same program, not just by random chance. It's because Herb Sendek is a great coach and a great talent evaluator, but it'll happen at more programs. And I'm curious how much more we're going to continue to see that, because it still seems like the other direction is better. Jalen Pickett is a good example of this, second-round pick here, spent the first couple of years of his career at Siena, transferred to Penn State, and we'll see it with more and more players. Marquise Noel didn't get drafted, but obviously the kind of player that made that kind of transfer as well. So I think that's more likely going to be the story we continue to see, the Baylor Shiremans of the world, the Grant Nelsons of the world, who transfer up a level and then succeed at that level and then go to the NBA. But I hope that we see more Brandon Pajemskis, because I think that balances out college basketball in a way that makes it more fun and makes the NCAA tournament more entertaining, with knowing that there's really talented players at programs that maybe aren't the typical programs you'd expect to see talented players at. Well, the gap between being a dominant college big man and an NBA player is honestly wider than it has ever been before, and it feels like back to the basket centers are going the way of the NFL running back. Before we get more into that, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Bird Dogs. I don't know how else to say it, so I'm just going to keep this simple. Folks, Bird Dogs shorts and pants, they make you look good. The Bird Dogs stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, and they give you a truly sculpted look. And look, we all want a little sculpted look on our legs, don't we? And Bird Dog shorts, well, they do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but they fit way better. They also fit better than regular shorts made of stiff, restricting cotton. How? Bird Dogs fixed it by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki but stretches so that you get a slimmer fit without sacrificing movement. It also uses anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that helps keep you cool and dry all day long. So go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege and enter the promo code LOCKEDONCollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That is birddogs.com/lockedoncollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off, we promise you. All right, folks, thank you all for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen of the day. Enjoy the weekend, and when you guys come back next week, Isaac and I are going to be discussing the biggest storylines of the year. We're also going to continue to keep you updated on things going on around the college basketball landscape as we get into July. All right, well, huge talking point on Locked On College Basketball throughout the season, huge talking point in just the overall college basketball landscape has been the treatment, I guess is the best way to put it, of dominant college basketball big men. This year was dubbed the year of the big before the season started, and most of the projections didn't even have Zach Edey as being the National Player of the Year, but then he came out and dominated alongside Drew Timme, alongside Oscar Tshiebwe, alongside Adama Sanogo, alongside Trayce Jackson-Davis and Hunter Dickinson, and all of these fantastic low post scoring dominant bigs. Well, none of them are in the NBA. And Trayce Jackson-Davis is the only one who got drafted in this group. Zach Edey, of course, returned to school. Hunter Dickinson, of course, returned to school. But the NBA is not prioritizing these players at all. And this isn't a shock. It's not like every mock draft had Timme and Tshiebwe and Sanogo and Azoulas Tubelis. It's not like all those guys were on every mock draft and all got undrafted and it was this big earth-shattering storyline. Most of them weren't expected to get drafted. But it's startling to look at how few college bigs got drafted this year. Here's the list by my account, and we can quibble on what's considered a big and what's not considered a big, and I'm completely content with that argument, but this is basically what I came up with. 3 freshmen and a senior were the bigs who got drafted in college. Number 1 was Derek Lively, who went 12th overall to Dallas. Of course, Lively, an elite rim runner, shot blocker, very, very high-end talent for him. Next was Noah Clowney at 21 to the Nets. I believe Noah Clowney can play some small ball 5 at the next level. He's maybe more of a 4 right now. So he's a bit questionable in calling him a big, but I will count him for the purposes of this conversation. Those are the only 2 in the first round. After that, you get all the way to 45 when the Memphis Grizzlies took GG Jackson. And yeah, we're going to talk more about that pick to close out the show because that's an interesting one right there. But Jackson, again, 6'9", a center-ish, but kind of more of a hybrid 4, maybe 3, depending on how that athleticism translates at the next level. But again, not really a traditional back-to-the-basket center. And then finally, one of the biggest shockers of the NBA draft, Trayce Jackson-Davis, Indiana star, all Big Ten legend, quite honestly. He fell all the way to 57th. Folks, he was the second to last player drafted. He goes to the Golden State Warriors. Fantastic fit for him. I think they're going to do some wonderful things with him, but Jackson-Davis was not happy about it. He tweeted, he said people are going to regret this, that he's going to make them pay, et cetera, et cetera. And look, I don't blame him. He could have come off the board at 35. He could come off the board in the late first. It wouldn't have been shocking. People were talking about him at 29 to Denver when they took Julian Strawther. And then the whole second round goes by and by and by, and no disrespect to the players picked ahead of him. Some of them are very, very good. Some of them were a bit mystifying as to why they were selected. But this is a clear sign that Trayce Jackson-Davis, for whatever reason, the skill set that he possesses was not valued very much by NBA scouts. And again, combine this with Timme and Tshiebwe and those guys all not getting drafted, and you kind of have a pretty clear message from the NBA. Hey, this is not a skill set that we're just prioritizing right now. And again, it's not like it was a shock going into the draft. Trayce Jackson-Davis slipping this far was more of a shock because he offers more on the defensive end of the floor. Timmy's a liability there. Tshiebwe is a good rebounder, but that's kind of it. Jackson-Davis is a legitimate rim protector. Now there's some concern about his size and all of that, but it's startling to not see him get respected the way that he probably should have been through this process. Good basketball players, purely talented players get skipped over a lot because teams want to prioritize youth. They want to prioritize upside. And I'm not necessarily saying this is wrong. Sometimes it's correct. Maybe these bigs, Sanogo and Tshiebwe and Timme, maybe they won't have good NBA careers. Maybe they won't have NBA careers at all. Maybe Trayce Jackson-Davis is going to struggle in a significant way in the NBA. I don't know. We're not there yet. But you see teams draft guys who had one semi-productive season of college basketball or one semi-productive season in the G League, or, are just young overseas players that they believe there's some untapped potential with. And again, sometimes teams hit on this. Nikola Jokic he was drafted during a Taco Bell commercial, and he ended up becoming a 2-time MVP and was led the Denver Nuggets to a championship. So obviously it can happen. But it is very obvious to me that these players need to continue to prioritize what is best for them, and what is best for them at this point sure seems to be staying in college. And I'm not going to blame any of those guys for making the decision they made this time. Tshiebwe and Timme already made tough decisions to return to school previously. Actually, so did Trayce Jackson-Davis. All those guys had opportunities to go earlier, had very productive college seasons. Tshiebwe returned after winning National Player of the Year. That is pretty unprecedented, but look what happened to him. Now you see Zach Edey returned after winning Player of the Year. You're not as surprised. You can't be as surprised to see him do that. When you see that Sanogo wins Most Outstanding Player in the NCAA tournament, I don't want to say single-handedly because it was a team effort, but was clearly the face of this UConn team that blasted their way through the NCAA tournament and won a national championship, and yet he doesn't get drafted. Drew Timme scored more points than anybody in Gonzaga basketball history. He did it in 4 years. He didn't use an extra year to do that. This is an 18, 20 point per game scorer, a guy who put up 25 points against Evan Mobley in the Elite Eight a couple of years ago against USC. He can score against NBA caliber bigs, just not in the way that NBA teams really want to. They don't want to put you on the floor and let you do that because it's just not what they're trying to space the floor. They're trying to do things differently, open up the lanes. They feel that Timme or Tshiebwe or those guys might be more in the way. And when you watch the modern NBA, you kind of get it. I kind of understand why they think that. But it's frustrating for these guys who can't do any more to be productive in college. I mean, they really can't. Drew Timme did everything that he was capable of doing. He worked hard on the three-point shot. He worked hard on the defense, and I think there's room for him to improve there. For the record, he signed with the Milwaukee Bucks, and most of the rest of these guys have already signed at least Exhibit 10 contracts or two-way contracts, so they're going to get a chance. They're going to get a chance in the Summer League. They're going to get a chance to earn a two-way contract. They're going to get a chance in the NBA. I think all of these guys, probably all of these guys are going to play in the NBA next season. And by these guys, I mean, of course, Jackson-Davis, who already got selected, Tshiebwe, Sanogo, Timme, and Azoulas Tubelis is the group that I'm really thinking about right now. And I think they'll all get a look. They'll all get a chance. But when you look at a player like Zach Edey making the decision to return to school, when you look at a player like Hunter Dickinson returning to school, transferring and going to Kansas, you start to see okay, I get why. I mean, we kind of already knew this, but there's no reason that this isn't going to continue to happen. If your team happens to have a dominant low post scorer who maybe doesn't stretch the floor all that well, who maybe doesn't play outstanding defense, even if they're an okay rim protector, but they're not really a good defender in space, you should be kind of happy to have that guy on your team because he might be there for 4 years. I mean, there's not a lot of reason for these guys to leave early. It's just not making sense for them, especially because they're so dominant in college. And if you have any kind of personality and you have the kind of drive to make money through NIL, the way that Timme did, the way that Jackson-Davis did, the way that Tshiebwe did, all those guys were big. And certainly Dickinson was prioritizing the NIL with his decision to go to Kansas. And I don't blame these guys. Go get your money because the NBA is not giving it out. They're just not. And they made a very clear statement in a few years in a row of making pretty clear statements about this kind of player. Kofi Coburn, Luka Garza, etc. We're not seeing those guys really succeed at that level. And And this year they just said, we're not even going to bother. We'll take Trayce Jackson-Davis because, man, he deserved to get drafted much earlier than 57, at least in my opinion. But this kind of player is not a priority for the NBA right now. And because they're so coveted in college, I think these players should continue to make the decision that most of them have been making of staying in school for as long as possible, dominating at that level, making as much money as you can, and then trying your hand at the NBA when you're ready. All right, well, we're going to close out the week with some NBA draft superlatives. Who is the biggest riser, biggest faller, and why this particular second-round player could be an all-star someday. More on that coming up right after this. All right, folks, closing out the show and the week here on Friday, talking more about the 2023 NBA draft. Both rounds concluded Thursday, late on the West Coast, very late on the East Coast for those of you who are still catching up on the draft stuff. We're going to talk about some superlatives, the surprise fall, surprise riser, best fit, at least in my opinion, worst fit, in my opinion, a second rounder who I think might be an all-star, and an undrafted free agent who I believe will outperform most of the players in the second round. So let's get right into it. We'll start with the surprise faller. Not a surprise anymore for those of you who watched the draft. Pretty obvious who the biggest faller was in the NBA draft process. That was Cam Whitmore from Villanova. Whitmore at times mocked as high as 4. We'd started to see some talk that he might slip to the late lottery. Most of the places I saw said he was slipping to like 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there. And then when the draft rolls around, he falls to 20. And in fact, he falls to the Houston Rockets, the very team that worked him out a bunch because they were considering him at number 4, where they took Amen Thompson from the overtime elite. So the Rockets get their guy at 4, lose out on their guy in Whitmore, and then wait 16 picks and get him again. Insane. What a draft for Houston to get Whitmore and Thompson. Now, obviously, there's a reason that Whitmore fell. There was concerns about his medicals. I don't know how serious the concerns are about his medicals. The Rockets indicated that it wasn't something that prevented them from choosing to draft him. Obviously, they didn't choose to take him at 4, but that's probably just because they liked Thompson better. For them to also get a look at Whitmore is huge. He's a tremendous athlete. There's some concerns about his facilitation, but the athleticism is there. If the injury stuff clears up, this could be an absolute heist for the Houston Rockets. Whitmore himself made it clear afterwards that he's motivated by this and he wants to prove some people wrong. And so Houston might have got themselves a really good one here. The surprise riser for me was Jett Howard at Michigan. Again, Jett Howard was expected to go kind of in that range that Whitmore went, in the early 20s, maybe teens, somewhere in the first round. You saw a few spots where he kind of glanced up towards the lottery, but ended up going number 11 to Michigan. And for me, what was surprising is there was kind of this group of shooters that I thought would all get drafted kind of in a similar range, but I thought Jett Howard was going to go last out of this group. And the group included Kobe Buffkin, his teammate at Michigan, included Jordan Hawkins at UConn, and included Grady Dick at Kansas. And Jett Howard went before all of them, which really surprised me. Dick went 2 spots later. Hawkins went, I think, right after Dick, and I think Buffkin went right after that. I think they went all back to back to back. Something close to that, if I'm not exactly right in that range. But Jett Howard went higher than all of them. And look, he's a 6'8", really, really good 3-point shooter. I get the appeal. He's not a good defensive player, and I think that this felt like a bit of a reach. It felt like Orlando could have traded back and still got him if they wanted to. It felt like they could have taken one of the more consistent shooters like Hawkins or Buffkin. I don't hate this pick, to be honest. I think Jett Howard is going to be fine. I think for Orlando, at least they didn't take another defensive-focused guard like they already have on the roster with Jalen Suggs, like they'd already taken with Anthony Black. I think Jett Howard is a bit more of a fit for Orlando's roster, but it's not the player I would have taken. We'll see if he ends up kind of having himself a productive NBA career. I think it's certainly possible that he could. And again, shout out to Michigan for having 2 players taken in the top 15, even if the season didn't go all that well for the Wolverines. But I was a little surprised to see Jett Howard go here. Best fit in the NBA draft. Everybody was talking about this fit, and I feel like I'm just kind of glomming on to that conversation. But honestly, it's hard to not love Jaime Jaquez going to Miami at 18. The former UCLA star really just kind of fits what Eric Spoelstra in Miami likes to do. He's a definitive role player. He's going to play within his role. He's a very smart basketball player. Not a great outside shooter. That is an area that you'd like to see some growth for him, but good at attacking the rim, very good mid-range game, just well-balanced scorer, tenacious defensive player. I think he's going to have a role right away for Miami. And I think if Miami makes it back or is anywhere close in the deep playoff run, I think Jaime Jaquez is going to be a part of it. And if you can get a guy at 18 who's contributing to a playoff team right away, you got to feel pretty good about it. And I think Miami fans should be really happy with adding Jaquez to their team. Worst fit for me, it's always hard to gauge this right away, especially if we don't know how the rosters are going to shake out. But I'm not a fan of Tshiebwe Jackson at Memphis. Thought this was a bit of an odd fit. Now, to be clear, this was the 45th pick in the draft. Tshiebwe Jackson has top 10 upside in this draft class. You have to gamble on that if you're Memphis. I don't hate them gambling on this pick. So I'm saying that I think this is a bad fit, but I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad pick, which I realize seems kind of counterintuitive. But when you're picking in the mid-second round, shoot for the guy with the highest upside. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. A lot of teams draft a guy at 45 that doesn't work. Like, it's not going to kill you. If you draft Tshiebwe Jackson at 17 or something and it doesn't work out, it's going to look a little worse. But this is just a big upside dart throw. But it's against what Memphis normally does. They love the older prospects. They've taken the Brandon Clarks and the Desmond Bains of the world in the past, and now they take this really young, really inexperienced, really raw player. Do they have the time to develop him? Are they willing to put in the time to develop him? He's not going to play right away necessarily. There's also some character stuff, and I don't want to get too far into that necessarily, but while I believe that Tshiebwe Jackson is somebody who could develop into a really good player, and I don't think that he's like a bad guy or anything, Memphis drafting somebody who has some character concerns is a bit of a choice considering what's going on in Memphis right now with the Dylan Brooks saga and, of course, the Ja Morant saga. Like, you'd think you'd want to stay away from that. But again, the upside is worth the risk here for Memphis. I just don't know if I like the fit right now for Tshiebwe Jackson with that Grizzlies team. Second round player who I think has the ability to be an all-star. I'm going Jordan Walsh. Jordan Walsh out of Arkansas went 38th, I believe it was, to the Boston Celtics. The offense needs to show up. Plain and simple. If there's no offense, there's no all-star. It just doesn't matter. But he is an all-star caliber defensive player. And I think Boston is the right program to get him on the floor in a situation where he can develop as an offensive player, not have a ton of pressure on him to contribute right away, learn the game, learn his offensive role, learn when to take open shots, and continue to improve as a scorer. I don't know if he's going to be an all-star based on his defense. He's not going to be a 20-point per game guy. He's maybe not even going to be a 15-point per game guy. At that point, it's difficult to make an all-star game. So I understand this is a bold prediction here, but he has the athleticism to be a all NBA caliber defensive player. And if the offense ticks up to at least average or even above average, maybe he's not an all-star, but is he the best player out of the second round? Probably. I think Boston got themselves a really good one here, and I love this selection for that program. And finally, undrafted free agent who will outperform most of the second round. I didn't think this was a super strong undrafted free agent class. I feel like most of the players that deserve to get drafted got drafted. We had our conversation about some of those bigs and Tshiebwe and Timme and whatnot, but for the most part, I didn't feel like there was glaringly, if Trayce Jackson-Davis had gone undrafted, that would have been a really glaring one. But otherwise, I don't think there are any major ones. I do want to shout out Princeton guard, and I apologize if I pronounced this wrong, Tosan Evbumwan. He signed with the Pistons. I think it was an Exhibit 10 contract, I believe, which means that it can eventually carry over to a two-way contract should Detroit choose to do that. He averaged 15.6 boards and 5 assists last year for the Tigers. 6'7" wing. He can do a little bit of everything. He needs to improve as a three-point shooter. That is probably what held him out of getting selected. He's also an older prospect, which can carry some risk for teams. But I think that Detroit got themselves a guy who can do a little bit of everything. If you were to shove him into an NBA rotation right now, he would contribute right away. And I think there's a reasonable chance he earns that role in Detroit. And in a few years from now, he's going to look like there's going to be a lot of names on that second round list that are not in the league anymore. And I think Tosan is somebody who will still be kicking at that point in the NBA. All right, folks, that is going to do it for us today and this week. Thank you so much for checking out the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Again, it is available wherever you get your podcasts. We are also available on YouTube. Go hit that subscribe button there if you have not done so yet. We'll be back next week with more coverage on the transfer portal, what's going on at Kentucky these days, some coaches getting suspended, all sorts of fun stuff happening in college basketball. We'll talk about that next week. For now, though, thank you all for listening, and peace out.